Hello, friends. We're back with episode 180 of the Our Weekly Highlights podcast. You know what? That's a cool number. Maybe we should 180 and call this the SAS Weekly Highlights podcast.
I get it.
No, I'm just kidding. No. Buckle up, folks. We're still the Our Weekly Highlights. I couldn't resist. Anyway, this is the weekly podcast where we talk about the awesome highlights and other resources that are shared every single week at ourweekly.org. My name is Eric Nance, and I'm delighted that you join us from wherever you are around the world. We're back at our usual recording time. But of course, just like usual, I never do this alone, at least not unless I'm forced to, because I still have my trusty co-host, Mike Thomas, with me. Mike, how are you doing this morning?
Doing well, Eric. Had a tiny little time change. I appreciate you being accommodating here, but we're getting it in.
We're getting it in one way, hook by crook. No matter if we're moving or doing chaotic virtual events, we always find a way, right?
Exactly.
Exactly. And just like finding a way, Our Weekly finds a way to release an issue practically every single week. And that is not possible without this being a community-driven effort by our curator team. And our curator this week is Tony El Harbar. Of course, he was made famous a few years ago with his participation in the Slice competition. I still have fond memories of watching that. But of course, he had tremendous help from our fellow Our Weekly team members and contributors like all of you around the world with your pull requests and other suggestions. And we're going to, actually for our first two highlights, we're going to definitely deep dive into some novel visualization upgrades for your toolbox. The first of which is a package that has gotten a lot of positive attention since it was released a few years ago. If you've ever been in the situation where you had multiple plots that you wanted to put together in a seamless, like multi-figure, multi-panel environment and have them be completely separate types of plots, Patchwork is your friend here. Patchwork is the R package that's been authored by Thomas Lynn Peterson, who is a software engineer on the Tidyverse team over at Posit. And in particular, Patchwork just had a major new release, version 1.3.0. And we're going to cover a few of the major features landing this release. And to start off with, I have some good friends in another industry, we'll call it, named Bubba Ray and Devon, and boy, they sure like their tables. They were telling me, Eric, get the tables for Patchwork. Well, guess what? We're going to get some tables for Patchwork because in this release, you are now able to not just put a ggplot2 type plot in Patchwork. You now have first-class support to put in a table created by GT. GT has made a lot of waves in the table generation ecosystem in R, which of course has been authored by Richie Owen, who did a wonderful presentation on the past and the future of GT at PositConf. But a lot of this feature is possible because of yet more terrific contributions to the open source GT package. This one authored by Toon Vandenbrand, who will be featured on another highlight later on. But he laid the foundation so that GT objects can now be composed or rendered as grobs, where if you're not familiar with what a grob is, that is the underpinning type of object that the system used by ggplot2 is using to compose the plots together in the underpinnings. So with both now a GT object as a grob and, of course, ggplot2 objects as grobs, they now can fit seamlessly into Patchwork. And we'll just, I'll cover a couple of the major things about this new feature. And again, this is brand new, but already out of the box, you're going to have terrific support to just literally just add this GT object in your Patchwork call, just literally adding the two objects together, and you're going to get the Patchwork rendered composition right away. And you get some niceties under the hood or as part of the functions with this, because you will now have first-class support for adding titles, subtitles, captions, just like you would in a normal GT, and they will show up just fine in a Patchwork composition as well. But if you want to customize things further for how tables are wrapped into this, there is, appropriate enough, a function called wrap_tables that's going to let you customize how the table utilizes, say, the space around it. So in Patchwork, each object gets put in what's called a panel. And with this wrap table, you can actually define which parts of the table are fitting into that panel. By default, it's every part of the table, which includes like row labels, titles, column headers, and whatnot. But you can actually customize which parts are actually going outside the panel area, such as maybe the top, the left margin, the right margin, and what have you. That's nice if you want to line things up in a more custom way. And then also with that, there are some other enhancements as well to how you define the layouts. And what's cool is that it's even going to be intelligent enough if you're doing like a top down composition and your table and your plot are sharing, say, the same variables in, say, rows or columns, they will automatically kind of line up next to each other. So your eye can visually track maybe that plot at the top with that particular variable and then the table at the bottom and line those values up. It's really slick how they do that. I have no idea how they did it, but it's a lot of awesome engineering around it nonetheless. And the one caveat I want to mention has to do with accessibility, because under the hood, when these tables are rendered as grobs and then put into a patchwork composition, the table is converted to an image PNG representation. Whereas by default in GT, if you're just creating the table, the default output format for that is HTML, which of course HTML, you can actually get the text that's representing that table and use that in accessibility type features. So if you are going to put a GT table in a patchwork setup, make sure to, especially if it's going in like a report, publication, or whatnot, make sure to complete the alt text for that entire patchwork to include not just the text around the plot itself, but also the text around the table. It might take a little getting used to, but if you're already well versed in how accessibility features in ggplot2 works, it should be a pretty seamless workflow for you. And then we'll also have a link to the show notes for additional content with regards to the GT release notes where this grob feature landed if you want to learn more about how that worked. But wait, there's more, as I say, in this patchwork release. And if you've been looking for a little freedom in your patchwork compositions, well, that has you covered with a lot of bells and whistles around that, doesn't it, Mike?
Yes, it does. And I believe in the previous version of Patchwork that was released, there was this new function called free that was added to the API. And I know that Thomas Lynn Peterson, who I think is one of the leads on the Patchwork project, not only talked about this function at PositConf last year, but was also really wanted to be really thoughtful about how this particular function called free was going to work, and really careful because as you noted, Eric, Patchwork does some pretty incredible stuff for us under the hood that you and I don't even understand necessarily how it works in terms of aligning axes and things like that. So Thomas wanted to be really careful, and I think that the Patchwork team wanted to be really careful that they made the correct decisions when it came to how this new free function was going to work. So there's some additional arguments that are now introduced into this free function that allow you to better sort of align multiple charts with each other. So one of those arguments is called side, which allows you to supply either a character T, R, B, or L. I think that's top, right, bottom, and left characters to indicate sort of which side you want to free up and not necessarily, fix axes and things like that. So there's, again, we're doing podcast on data visualization. You're going to be best served if you take a look at the blog yourself. But he has a great example of using the side equals L argument to free up the left side of the plot while the right side of the plot sort of stays fixed, if you will, with the plot below it. There is also a type possible argument within the free function as well, which prior to that type argument being introduced, when you were stacking, for instance, vertically two plots on top of each other, sometimes a plot that had an axis label that access label would be pushed way out if the other plot above it, if you will, in this particular example, did not have an axis title. So that axis title in the one plot that did have an axis title was kind of floating way out in space in situations where you had long sort of axis labels on one plot. And again, the blog post does a great job of demonstrating an example here. So now we have this type equals label argument that we did not have previously that pushes that axis label on the one plot that does have the axis title, much closer to the axis labels themselves. So it's not that axis title is no longer sort of floating out in space, which is really helpful. There is also a type equals space argument that sort of just better condenses, from what I can tell, your plots and the white space and the margins between your plots, which is always something that I've had a tricky time doing, especially when we are trying to, in a lot of instances, we might be saving this as some sort of an image file that we're then putting into a Quarto presentation or something like that. And white space becomes very important when you were trying to fit a lot of content on a slide, for instance, or in a PDF. Right, so we have this new type equals space argument that allows us to better manage that. And I think that there might be a couple of additional bug fixes in this highlight as well. But the new functionality, is really helpful. I've been doing a lot of work lately, unfortunately, in matplotlib. Some of this stuff is equivalent and possible, but some of it wrestling with spacing and white space and what are called subplots in matplotlib is very, very tricky. And I wish that I had the patchwork package available over there.
Yeah, it's once you start using it, you don't know how you live without it. I mean, this has been an issue that I wrestled with so much back in my earlier days of helping do a lot of biomarker analyses and creating custom PDF reports. So we wouldn't just have one type of plot, we would have multiple types, and then trying to get into the grid system to do all the alignment manually. It was a major undertaking. Patchwork is just giving you such a elegant API that fits so natively with the ggplot2 layered philosophy of the grammar graphics. It really is hard to replicate this across different languages. So anytime I need these type of ggplots to be present, especially in a report, patchwork is going to be my go-to for it. My greedy ask has been, and I've been not the only one asking this, but if you recall, there was some work to create animated ggplots, or ggAnimate, that Thomas took over from David Robinson. Oh, I'm so greedy. I would love to have patchwork work with those, but that's okay. I can wait for that, because this is already spectacular in terms of the compositions we have at our disposal. And now with GT, the possibilities are even more endless, in my opinion. And like many things in the R community, there's a lot of synergy in respect to this issue, because our next highlight is coming from that same contributor I mentioned that helped build the foundation for getting GT tables into Patchwork. And this next highlight is a brand new R package that has hit the ecosystem, authored by Toon Vandenbrand, who is a PhD student at the Netherlands Cancer Institute. And apparently, he's been working on a lot of ggplot2 stuff in his previous open source efforts. But in particular, this new effort is a new R package called G Guidance. I have to catch myself from saying GG Guidance because of ggplot2, but hopefully I got it right. But nonetheless, if you've ever wanted or found yourself in a situation where, you get a lot of nice customizations already out of the box with respect to your guides and other aspects of how you customize your axes labels and your legend attributes in ggplot2, the vanilla version of it, G Guidance is going to give you kind of a more elegant way to bring some additional customization with some of its own versions of these guides. And this vignette that we're going to be highlighting here, that we'll put in the show notes as well, has a nice summary of two kind of major categories of these features. I'm going to lead off with these really great functions that are prefixed with guide underscore axis. So these are tailored towards bringing some additional formatting possibilities to the way your axis labels and tick marks are specified. The first of which is guide axis custom. And this is great for when you have, your typical two-dimensional plot with an X and Y axis, and those axes are some kind of positional type metric, maybe a discrete scale or a bin to continuous scale. And this is great when you want to add a little customization to it. Say one of the things that comes out of the box is on the tick marks, you can add what are called bi-directional tick marks, where again, as an audio podcast, it's going to be hard to say this, very clearly, but it gives you kind of both the line at the bottom of that axis line and above it as well. So in case you want that visual cue of where the axis label tick actually starts, it's a nice little visual cue around that. But the real selling point in tones of a vignette here about this function comes when you decide in your plot to switch maybe the coordinate system, going from, say, the typical scatter plot like XY, two-dimensional layout to a more radial, type, circle layout. In the past, you would have to also modify the guide yet again in your ggplot2 call when you switch those coordinate systems. But with guide axis custom, it is intelligent enough to know when you switch that coordinate type of system, and you don't have to customize it any further. So there's a great example in the vignette here where he goes from like the scatter plot type visualization to a radial plot, but he could keep the guide axis call exactly the same. That's pretty handy when you have to switch these, on the fly without a lot of friction in between. And then another really neat feature, and I don't remember when this landed in ggplot2 proper, but now on your axes, you can have nested axes where maybe you have, in the case of the vignette here, you've got a bar chart where you've got different flavors of a product of food, maybe, coffee, tea, apple, pear, whatever. And then you've got a more overarching category for these. So you can put that overarching category underneath the appropriate labels. And you can do this with ggplot2 proper. But what is offered in this package is a way to customize how you're exactly doing that categorization, or maybe you have a leftover category in your nested top, sub level, and you don't care about putting that under any top level, so you just want to leave that blank. You can do that by manually defining a key of these labels as a simple data frame like setup. But then you can also customize, instead of just having a horizontal line that separates these heading or these nested labels, you could have like a curly bracket, or you can have, in fact, up to 7 types of brackets that come out of the box for that separation between the sub labels and the top level labels. And yes, if you're adventurous enough, with creative enough, you can create your own bracket style by feeding in a simple kind of matrix of X and Y coordinates. And in the example, he's got like a jagged line instead. Wherever you want to do that's beyond me. But the cool point is that if you really want full control over the visual cues of these nested labels, you've got a lot of power exposed to you with this awesome function of guide axis nested. So I'm definitely going to be checking that one out. But there is a lot more to this with respect to color customization. So Mike, why don't you take us through what he offers you in this package?
Yes, there is. There are these 2 functions, guide call bar and guide call steps, which we'll talk about first, which are pretty incredible, that allow us to be able to either have, sort of this continuous gradient in our legend color gradient, or we can have something that looks more like a discrete color gradient, where we have, specific sort of bins for the particular colors that we're going to show in our legend that correspond to the colors that are shown on the plot as well. There's this notion of caps as well, where you can sort of fix your color scale in your legend and have it bounded with a lower limit and an upper limit. And then you can have a shape that also has a corresponding, perhaps different color. In this case, it's gray, because he's trying to show that these values would be out of bounds, anything above 30 or below 10. And he has a triangle on either side of the color guide here in the legend to represent what are called these caps on the legend or the guide, if you will, which are pretty cool. You can also implement those caps as shapes, and he uses triangles in the example here. But instead of having them be these out of bounds values, you could have them be these colors that sort of still correspond to your gradient that you're using. In your chart, you can cap just one side, either the top or the bottom of the legend, which is pretty interesting as well. Just a lot of different flexibility to do things here. And then sort of similar, Eric, to what you were talking about in terms of brackets, on the axes of the chart, you can also add brackets to the legend. So there's one example here where he's sort of creating brackets on the legend that classify values in group A, or if you're higher up in the gradient, then you would belong to group B, and you can stick those brackets right against the side of your legend, which is a really, really cool feature, something I had never really thought about myself as well. He has an example here where the legend itself is radial. It's a circle. It kind of looks like a donut chart or a clock, if you will, where you have this sort of polar coordinate system for your legend, which is really interesting. I can't think of a use case where I would necessarily employ that over a legend that's just rectangular. But it's wild that we have the ability to do that. So a lot of customization here, a lot of flexibility. I think one of my main takeaways in terms of the most, what I take away as some of the most useful functionality of this package is it's almost like chart annotation, right? He has one example in here where the x-axis is time, it's years, and it's some sort of a political, I think it's unemployment rate, right? And it's intended to be a political type of chart. And he has these horizontal brackets underneath the x-axis values that show the administration, the name of the president at the time. And those values are going to change based upon whether they serve 4 years or 8 years or different, the horizontal width of those particular bars. And, I think that annotation is a really powerful addition to the chart, in regards to the story that you may be trying to tell. Obviously, the subgroups as well in the bracketing and the boxes that we talked about, I think can be really, really helpful for, again, doing the additional things and custom things that we need in our visualizations to ensure that we're getting our point across as effectively as possible.
Yeah, I want to, dive in on that as I've been digesting this more since I read about it. I feel like this is really still trying its best with these additional aesthetic kind of customizations to keep the viewer's attention on the main event, so to speak, of the plot itself, but then putting some nice annotations around that main area without you having to really switch context and maybe looking at a paragraph below the plot that talks about like categories of these color ranges or like these different like inherent groupings that are comprising these data points like the time axis or whatnot. I think this is wonderful from like a best practices when you've got to nail that initial look at these data. And there have been countless workshops about effective visualization with ggplot2, and those great materials by Cedric Schurer and others are still must reads if you find yourself doing this routinely. I feel like this package, G Guidance, is giving us, our users that don't really want to dive into the realms of utilizing another program such as Adobe Illustrator or other software to do those like fancy customizations you often see in blog posts or whatnot. Now we can do a lot of that here, and especially with making it the striking the balance between overwhelming the user but then not having enough information. I think this is hitting the sweet spot even in this early stage, which I am, thoroughly impressed for. This isn't even on CRAN yet. This is its initial release, I believe, of this package. So I am, like I said, very impressed by this. I'm definitely going to recommend this both to future collaborators that want to level up their ggplot2 visualizations with these nice annotations. And of course, I may be using this in the future as well. So job well done, Tone. And we can't wait to see what's next in this package. Well, let's take a little break from our visualization roundup there, and we're going to go back to school a little bit, Mike, and I hope you're ready because you're going to have to dust off some concepts. Ironically, my oldest son is starting to learn about in this last highlight here, and this was spurred on by a LinkedIn post that was discovered by Peter Ellis, who actually was featured on the highlights of the last episode with his blog post on the Australian census. Well, he's back in a decidedly different topic this time around, where, as I mentioned, he saw on LinkedIn this post about how a particular number, 397, and this was conjectured to be the largest prime number that can be represented uniquely as the sum of three positive squares. So let's step back a little bit because, we got to dust off my cobwebs here a little bit. If you're not familiar with what a prime number is, this is the concept where there are no smaller numbers other than that number times one that you can use to derive the product of to get to that same number. So a classic example, the number 5, right? You can't do like 2 times 2 or whatever. It's got to be 1 times 5 or 5 times 1. That's the concept of a prime number. And Mike, you're going to keep me honest here.
We're talking integers.
Integers, yes. Thank you. Integers, yeah. Good caveat. See, I knew I'd be rusty on this. But as Peter read this, he wanted to, in his mind, he's going to change the wording a little bit to this as being 397 is a conjectured largest prime number integer that can be represented as the sum of 3 positive squares of integers in exactly one way. So, had I been very much smarter, maybe there would be a way you could figure out a clever mix of linear algebra or other optimization to solve for this in a rigorous mathematical proof. I'm not one of those people. So, like what my approach might be, Peter decides to take matters in his own hands. He calls it a brute force approach, which actually isn't too brute force, but you can kind of get the logic of this as we talk through it. He decided to do a couple things. For a given, what we'll call max integer, he used 30 in this example. He first computes all of the squares of those numbers, saves that as a vector. And then for a visualization later on, he's actually going to leverage a package called primes, which I never heard about until this post, and I did some research on this. This is a package that's authored by Oz Keys. We'll have a link to it in the show notes for all sorts of derivations and testing with respect to prime numbers and R. So he's going to have that kind of on the back burner, but he's going to leverage the tried and true expand.grid to take basically all those squares, that vector of squared numbers, and do 3 columns of them to represent the 3 numbers that have to be added to get to this, magical prime number. He's going to expand grid all the combinations of those and then filter for when those are uniquely different from each other and that the sum of that is 397. And sure enough, when he does that filtering in the blog post, you can see that it's the numbers 9, 64, and 324 that get you to that final result. Now, that's great for, the smaller cases. Certainly, if you want to beef this up further, yeah, you're going to start needing some processing time if you go above 30 for the possible other answers you could derive here. But it's just he does some additional customization to count how frequently some of these other results might happen with these different combinations. And say they're like for the number 54, he found that there were 3 instances where you can satisfy this requirement. But as you think about all the ways to explore this, this could balloon up pretty quick. So to wrap it all up, he's got this nice visual set of visual charts of ggplot2 to look at all the possible prime numbers with a given range on the x-axis, and the number of times that these are occurring on the y-axis, or the number of ways that you can derive to that particular prime number. And as you can see, he does a nice annotation on the first one to show where 397 lies. And then as you bump up that number from 30 to a much higher, such as 10,000, and then ballooning it up even more, yeah, it's gonna eat up some horsepower on your machine, because of course default R is memory based, right? You're going to be making this massive data set of these different combinations. So he conjectures whether we could have like a way to fit this nicely into a database structure, which sounds like a nice challenge for you readers out there if you want to try that out. But a nice little exercise that, once again, with the power of R and its capacity under the hood, you don't always have to have that fancy mathematician mindset to figure out data-driven approaches to these answers. So maybe I give this to my son as a homework assignment one day. I have no idea.
There you go. No, it's a nice little brain teaser. I enjoyed it. I thought it was a really unique and interesting post, and I thought the data visualization aspect of it was interesting. I'm not sure if that's an approach that I would have thought of when trying to solve this problem and come to this answer. And I think it does a great job. We have a few different plots here, essentially representing the same exact thing, that really demonstrate that this number 397 is the largest number that is uniquely able to be the sum of 3 positive squares of integers, and it's the highest prime number, if you will. Like the ggplot annotation, the little red circle around the dot across the three plots, which is really nice. I believe it's just all base ggplot that we have here, and some dplyr code. And it's incredible, sort of simulation-based analysis, what we can do with really just 2 packages, dplyr and ggplot.
Yeah, and it's gave me flashbacks to a project at the day job where we had a situation for smaller sample sizes. We couldn't rely on the normal approximation to help derive some of our probabilities of success and p-value inferences. So we had to make our own exact type of solution, but we couldn't be exact from a mathematical sense. We had to brute force what you might have had in your classical statistics or data science courses when you're learning about p-values for the first time. And maybe this doesn't happen now because yours truly is a dinosaur in terms of the world now. But we had lookup tables of the p-values in the back of our textbooks for the t distribution, the normal distribution, the f distribution or whatnot. And we had to do this kind of thing with our situation where we made up this distribution, but we did a pre-configured set of configurations of these p-values, not too dissimilar to having a configuration of n's in these p-value lookup tables of yesteryear. And yeah, we found out that if we did a bunch of these combinations, our resources, this data frame holding all that, would blow up, and it would slow our app down immensely. So we fixed that quite a bit in this upcoming release of this re-envisioning of this app. But I got flashbacks to if you don't have the right answer, sometimes you got to brute force it somehow. And sure enough, this is another interesting use case of that. And of course, the real geeky side of me thinks, what if you could do all this in DuckDB and have a huge, massive table out of all this that you could explore with a Shiny app? What am I thinking? I have no idea. Mike, you got to watch me on this. I have no idea.
That'd be pretty cool, Eric.
Sounds like a challenge I may have just opted myself into by accident. Nonetheless, what's not an accident? The rest of this issue is no accident in how awesome it is, right? This is all curated very handily and very carefully by our curator every week. In this case, it is the aforementioned Tony Elharbar. And there's a lot more to this issue, but we're going to take a couple of minutes for our additional finds that that caught our attention. And for me, it's as I'm starting to learn more about leveraging AI modeling into my workflows. I'm still very much in my baby steps of this journey. One thing I have been pretty, passionate about is where we can leverage the open source model tooling and creative ways of utilizing that. So Stephen Turner's recent post on his blog, we featured Stephen in a few highlights ago. He has a great blog post about how he was able to create the newly released OLAMA 3.1.405b, which basically is the way they denote how many parameters, in this case 405 billion parameters. And now he was able to set that up on a GitHub repository to incorporate into Hugging Face to expose as a custom model deployment. Not something I've ever tried before. And he does warn in the post that with this amount of parameters, the responsiveness is not always great, and that there might be alternatives if you really need speed, such as using the 70 billion parameter model instead. But it's another kind of showcase to me of some of the flexibility that we get with these open source models, which in my industry is going to be something we have to pay a lot of attention to. So I thought that was a pretty clever use of at least one existing platform, but opening the possibilities of what we can do with these model choices.
That's super interesting, Eric. It's something that we've been toying around with. So I'm going to have to take a look at that blog post as well. I found a great blog from Shannon Pileggi on her blog called Piping Hot Data. Shout out Shannon. Had the opportunity to meet her in real life at Posit Conference this year, which was pretty cool. And she has a very applicable blog post, something that we've wrestled with quite a bit, which is REnv and the sort of repository that you're going to use, CRAN versus Posit Package Manager. And if you are not already using Posit Package Manager, or I guess some other service that, maybe rUniverse that provides binaries, you definitely should with your REnv projects. And a lot of times by default, REnv in the lock file, the repository that's specified is CRAN, which isn't always going to install binaries of the packages that you need when you run REnv restore. So Shannon points out this handy file in the this handy function in the REnv package called lock file modify, which allows you to change your repository, for example, from CRAN to Posit Package Manager. And then there is a second function in REnv called lock file write that would allow you to overwrite your lock file with that change, which is pretty cool. One of the questions that I have here, something that I'm going to have to dive into myself, is to ensure that this would also update the specified repository in your REnv lock file that is there for every package as well. So your first entry in your lock file is typically the repository or repositories that you're going to use. And then every individual package in your lock file as well also, links to the particular repository that was specified in that header that you want to use to install that particular package. As a sort of a cheat, sometimes when we're switching from CRAN to Posit Package Manager, I'll leave the name or the label of the repository as CRAN, but we'll change the URL from CRAN to packagemanager.posit.co instead, so that we don't have to change all of the package entries. But if there is a much better way than Control F and replace all to do that, which it seems like these functions that Shannon's pointed out for us might be able to accomplish, I am absolutely all ears. So really appreciate this blog post, because I think it's an applicable use case for all users of the REnv package.
Yeah, I've done that exact same hack or trick that you call it literally this week. As those of you, nobody listened to the pre-show of this, but Mike and I were exchanging a bit of war stories of especially me and my recent Shiny Test 2 Golem headless browser adventures with Docker. That's been a nightmare to deal with. But there was one point where I had to replicate my dev environment to a Docker container. And in my work setup, we have an internal repository that's like CRAN, but in our firewall. And of course, that's not going to play nicely with Docker, especially on GitHub Actions. So yeah, I switched that to Posit Package Manager, but I'm going to have to take the advice that Shannon has here and see if this is a more elegant way to dynamically do this instead of being like a a silly person and manually do that every time I pivot to a different architecture. So the creative juices are going after reading this post for sure. But yeah, if you want to get creative, we invite you to check out the rest of the issue of our weekly. There's a whole bunch of additional content with new packages, new resources, and upcoming events. And in fact, you mentioned Shannon earlier, Mike. She and I will be part of a team that's going to, we don't have the full details ironed out just yet in terms of the timing of it. But later in October, as part of the R Pharma conference, we're having a diversity workshop with respect to getting started with version control. So Shannon will be one of the leads on that. I'll be teaming up with my fellow R Weekly member, Sam Palmer, on a project to get those that are new to Git, that want a gentle introduction to that, up and running. It's going to be a lot of fun. We're putting all the finishing touches on that, so we'll be able to talk more about that later on. But yeah, that's just one of the things that you might find in that upcoming events section, along with many other great resources. So, how's the best keep the project going? Well, we can't do this without you, the community. So, any great blog post, resource, tutorial, anything that you think is useful to the R community, whether it's by yourself or by members of the community, we're just a pull request away on our GitHub page, but you can find all of that at rwiki.org. The little link to the pull request is in the upper right little ribbon there. It'll take you to the template, very easy to fill out, all marked down all the time, very easy to parse that through. And then our curator for the week will be able to get that merged in and be on your way. And also, we love hearing from you in the audience. We've got a contact page in your podcast player show notes for this episode, directly linked there. You can also send us a fun little boost with one of those modern podcast apps like Fountain, Podverse, Cast-O-Matic. Lots of great happening, especially in the Fountain ecosystem these days. I'm paying attention to lots of great choices on that. And also, you can get in touch with us on the social medias. I am on Mastodon at our podcast at podcastindex.social. Also on LinkedIn, just search my name and you'll find me there. And sporadically on the WeaponX thing, although really not so much anymore. But if you must, I am at the Rcast on there. Mike, where can listeners find you?
You can find me on Mastodon at Mike_Thomas at fosstodon.org. You can find me on LinkedIn if you search Ketchbrook Analytics, KETCHBROOK. You can see what I'm up to lately.
Very good. Always a fun time when you see you post on there. But it's always been fun recording with you as always. But we're gonna close up the docket here before more things get mangled in our respective setups. So with that, we're gonna say goodbye to this edition of our Weekly Highlights, and we hope to see you back for another edition of our Weekly Highlights next week.